Good evening and welcome to Dig This. My name's Tom Levy from the UCSD Department of Anthropology, and tonight my guest will be Dr. Seetha Reddy, a senior archaeologist from the cultural resource management firm of ASM Affiliates here in San Diego. Good evening. How are you doing?
Good evening, Tom. Thanks for having me today.
It's great to have you with us, Seetha. Seetha, you recently are coming out with a book called Discerning Palettes of the Past, an ethnoarchaeological study of crop cultivation and plant usage in India. And I wonder if we could begin with you telling us what is ethnoarchaeology?
Well, one of the ways you can talk about or think about ethnoarchaeology is the way to understand human behavior and archaeology, past lifestyles, by looking at present cultures, be it in any realm of life, whether it's how you live your life, how you structure your space, build your houses, cook your food, plant, agricultural aspects, pretty much every aspect, you study the present. And when I mean the present, typically most ethnoarchaeologists have, tried to look at more traditional societies, meaning non-mechanized societies, to look for some kind of indicators or signatures that will help you understand the past. So typically you have to be an ethnographer, for that aspect of the work where you go.
So this is archaeologists being
ethnographers, right? Okay. So as you go out as an archaeologist, so you kind of looking for different things than if you were a cultural anthropologist. So what you're looking for is in the present culture, if you're studying farmers or hunter-gatherers or pastoralists, what you're looking for is what are they leaving behind that would help us as archaeologists when we look at an archaeological site, be it a town or a city or a hunter-gatherer camp or a village house. How will it help us understand, reconstruct what has happened in the past. And nowadays, there are some ethnographers who also go and study the more urban settings, to look at, whether it's apartment buildings, relationships between, the spatial interaction of neighbors, to look at some of how, ancient city apartment complexes, worked and spatial relationships of individuals in there. So that's, in a nutshell, it's, ethnographers, archaeologists going out as ethnographers to study the present, to understand the past.
Now, you did your PhD at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and you did your fieldwork in India. Is India a great place to do ethnoarchaeology?
I would say India is one of the very few remaining places where there are pockets of populations who still practice non-mechanized lifestyles. They do still practice traditional lifestyles where you have small groups of individuals where they are hunter-gatherers or pastoralists or small farmers with very small holdings, between 1 and 5 acres of land, who are not involved in a market economy, but are involved in a more trade and barter exchange systems. They, as you notice, I said pockets because most of India has been influenced, by technology of various kinds, whether it's basic electricity, where you get pumps of different kinds helping out. Even when you look at hunter-gatherers, they have been affected by the 20th and of course now the 21st century development, and a lot of hunter-gatherers have been forced to settle and they are semi-settled. So you do have to take that into consideration, but definitely India is one of the few places.
Now, you were part of a larger research project to study the emergence of the Indus Valley civilization. How did your ethnoarchaeological research contribute to studying the rise of this ancient civilization?
My research focus has really been on looking at the interrelationship between human behavior and the economic systems, and more specifically the subsistence, the agricultural aspect of the subsistence. So one of the things that I was interested in is not so much as how the cities functioned and how the cities contributed to the economy and what was in the cities that made up the Harappan civilization, because a lot of work has been done and continues to be done on, the focuses on the cities. I was interested more in the peripheries and in the small towns and the small villages.
Sort of like a bottom-up view of complexity?
Exactly, bottom-up view, and rather than, it's also very interesting to know, and you need to know what's happening in the cities because they are the governing centers, where all the centralized political control is concentrated. But really I was more interested in seeing how does the countryside, how does the landscape fit into this, how do the political leaders or the individuals who control the Harappan culture, how did they influence, the surrounding areas, and how can we see that archaeologically? And particularly, there's been some debate on the provisioning of these cities, where these cities are essentially where you have all the craft specialists, where you have the governing bodies, which is, makes perfect sense. But where's the food coming from? Who are the food producers?
So you decided to look in the villages.
Right, look in the villages and see, how are the villages interacting? So to do that, what I did is look at two different types of villages or small towns. One was a very small village that had some pastoral component to it, so there might have been some individuals who were pastoralists, maybe families, several families, and maybe part of the village was also, small agriculturalists.
Excuse me, do you mean an archaeological site now?
Right, I'm talking about archaeological site.
Okay.
So I looked at that, and then I also looked at a larger village, possibly a town, because there is some construction of walls, which required considerable amount of labor, organization. There's a town wall and some kind of a revetment against flooding. So there might have been, a level of complexity in terms of organizing the labor and facilitating. So what I did is I looked at these, different kinds of, countryside settlements, a small village and a small town, to really understand how that fit into the centralized city economy and the Harappan system.
Now this is in the state of Gujarat, is that right?
Right, in the state of Gujarat, which is located in northwest India. And that really is I would say, the southeastern limit of the Indus Valley tradition. That spans both Pakistan and what is, India today. Obviously, prehistorically, there was no distinction.
Right. How many square miles or kilometers did this Indus Valley civilization expand, do you think?
Oh, it was hundred thousands of kilometers, and it really is very difficult to say exactly where it ends, because what you have that is another aspect that interested me, was the further you go away from the core areas, for example, the sites of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, what you do see is varying regional traditions. So for example, in Gujarat, what you have is the overlying greater Indus tradition, but underlying it is a very distinctive regional tradition that is very specific to Gujarat. Similarly, when you go into the Karachi area in Pakistan, coastal Pakistan, you have this overlapping, all-encompassing Indus Valley tradition, but then you still have this localized, expression, a cultural expression of that, particular area. And what you do see is, as you go further away from the main Indus River, this all-encompassing Indus influence is lesser and lesser. So, the big question is, are the rulers, the political associates, are they coming out to these outerlying periphery areas, whether it's Gujarat, the Kutch area or Punjab in India, and further into the Baluchi hills in the western part of Pakistan. How is this cultural influence being imparted? Is it direct, people moving out, or is it through trade and exchange, essentially an influence? And what is it about the Indus Valley civilization that makes someone, as far away in Gujarat, in the southeast of this entire area, want to adopt the Indus Valley cultural tradition? Those are definitely some of the questions that a lot of scholars are working on.
So when you were trying to tackle this problem yourself, why did you decide to use the metaphor discerning palettes of the past?
Discerning palettes of the past, essentially what I was trying to get at is that you need to look at the specific needs of each community to talk about what they are growing and what they are eating. Just because you find certain kinds of archaeological remains, specific like plant remains, where you find wheat, barley, and what you do find around 2000 BC which is at the end, towards the end of the climax of the urban state, is these new crops, millets, that are becoming more popular, in the economic system. And what traditionally archaeologists have done is that when you recover plant remains from this archaeological sediments, it's assumed that they are plants that people ate because they are in the archaeological sediments. I disagree with that. It's not such a simplistic equation. But you really need to look at what the source of these seeds are. Was the source of this seed, of this assemblage of seeds, food source, or was it fuel, or could it be fodder?
So was it the ethnographic present that alerted you to this? Or?
Definitely, it was having observed the ethnographic presence over decades really, and seeing that it's not a simplistic equation, that they are multiple uses of crops, that alerted me to thinking critically to say, well, what is really the source of these plants? And one needs to really look at defining the various sources. And sometimes it's not possible to define all the sources, but we really need to be aware of that.
So how did you do your, let's leave the archaeology behind for a moment. How did you go out and study the contemporary village life to get at these questions?
One of the main objectives of my ethnographic studies was to really understand what are all the different processes that occur from the time you plant a crop, regardless of what crop it is, to when it comes, prepared as a meal, on the table. So trying to define all the different stages, if you want to see it that way, that it goes through and gets processed and reduced ultimately to tortilla or rice or porridge, etc.
Chapati.
Or chapati or roti.
You can use that here.
Yes. So what are the stages that are entailed in that? So what I did is essentially go out. It definitely took a lot of groundwork because you just can't go.
How much time did you spend on this?
I spent about 2 years
Wow.
when I went out prior to starting my ethnographic work, when I went out to do the archaeology, to kind of get to know the farmers, gain their confidence, and talk to them really about what I'm interested in, and seeing if they're willing to help me, to work with me, because I ended up learning most of what I know about the different crop processing from these farmers who were patient enough to sit and talk to me about it, and chose which areas I wanted to study, because I wanted to choose more than one area so that one could look at variability in practices.
And did you collect samples to mark all these different stages in the crop processing?
Definitely. What I did is essentially started from the sowing, and as the plant went from each stage, once it was sown, there's tending, and then it's ready for harvest. And different plants are harvested in by different methods. So for each one of these methods, at each stage of processing, from harvesting through threshing to winnowing, sieving, et cetera, at each stage I collected samples for the different crops and the different methods of processing, and took those samples back, you know,
to
my
Wisconsin.
No, actually, I couldn't take the samples back to Wisconsin because it's an agricultural product.
Too bad.
So I analyzed it in the field, you
I
know,
see.
for different components. So really, you know, I had to go and get into the botany of it, you know, for the different plant parts and what gets filtered out at each stage and what remains in the product, and that is put through the next stage. And really what I was looking for is the signatures at each stage.
The archaeological.
Well, ethnographic signatures
Okay.
that could help me identify an archaeological context. So for example, at threshing, what is processed out? You know, and when I mean what, it means the different types of plant parts that are processed out. Where are they discarded? You know, are they discarded in the field? Are they discarded at home? What are they used for? Are there any uses? A lot of times these byproducts have uses as fodder for different animals, whether it's cattle. Very rarely it's goat and sheep, but sometimes for poultry, etc. And where are they given them? Are they just thrown out into the fields? Are they taken home? Is there storage involved? Now, issues like storage were very important because that increases the chances of archaeological discovery. Because at each stage you have a lot of material that's processed out and has the potential for entering the archaeological record, but with plant remains, unlike stone tools and ceramics, we really need to look for survivability, and they have to be carbonized.
Oh, so how did you make the leap from observing the ethnographic present and use that to build these cultural models of the past?
What I did is for each different types of crop, I built a model of processing. What are the different processes it goes through and what are the signatures of each stage? And then when I looked at my two different sites, I did intensive sediment collection and did flotation to retrieve plant materials. And what was most important is getting a lot of samples and from varied contexts, from hearths, from house floors, outside, inside trash pits, etc. And for each assemblage, try to identify what they most likely represented, a threshing product or sieving product, and could they have been created by any other process besides, you know, processing stage during, you know, crop cultivation, etc. So it's a lot of, you know, probability studies on, you know, could this assemblage have resulted from any other activity, you know, besides the crop processing.
So how did you use that information to explain the relationship between the provisioning of the cities, as you mentioned?
The main question that I was after is when we look at these small towns and villages and we find plant remains, we automatically assume that they were growing barley, they were growing wheat or millets, etc., legumes, and they were provisioning the cities. What I looked at and tried to explain through these models is it's not necessary that they were cultivating them always, because when I looked at the small site that had a pastoral component, all the assemblages I had, the archaeological plant assemblages, indicated that the occupants were not cultivating the crop. They were actually obtaining it through trade and exchange from another agricultural village or town. And really the main function, the economy of the small village with a pastoral component was pastoralism. So when I contrasted that to the small town, what was very clear is that there was cultivation of varied number of crops, but for different processes. Some crops were being cultivated as human food, some crops were only being cultivated as fodder. And that was a whole different view of, you know, trying to get at how does one identify crops that were not being cultivated, you know, for human food, but just, you know, were for animal fodder. And ultimately to link the assemblages from these small sites to the large cities. And the main result of my study for this ethnographic work was that there's some stages that occur at the villages that are not represented in the cities. If the cities are getting the materials from the little towns and villages, if they are buying the seed, for certain services, whether it's political protection, etc., then they would be buying these seeds, these grain, as relatively cleaned product. So if you start seeing indicators of threshing stages or some of the early winnowing stages or sieving stages at the large sites or larger sites, then you know that there is some cultivation in that, by the occupants of that site too. So the question really comes down to, can we identify cultivation per se as an activity by the site occupants rather than just the presence or absence of food grains?
And that tells a lot about the independence of the major centers and craft specialization.
Exactly, and codependence of the countryside to these centers, and codependence on different craft specialists to food producers.
Now, you go out to a little village or a couple of villages in Gujarat, and you get enough data for your PhD, and you come back here and get a good job and all that. What are some of the ethical issues for you as an archaeologist working in a small town like that or village in India?
As archaeologists working with living people, and your subject of study is, a living culture rather than a past culture, it is very similar to a cultural anthropologist's, obligations to the societies they study. You have to be very careful in protecting their privacy, because a lot of times the farmers don't want some of the information that they impart to you to be shared with individuals. So, there's a lot of, you gain the confidence, you have to make sure that you are very open and honest with them about what you do. And I also strongly believe that, once, as you said, we collect our data, we leave, and they really shouldn't be out of sight, out of mind. You have a certain obligation to return, what they've given you in terms of they've educated me about their systems, and I got a PhD, so you return it, whether it's in terms of materialistic returns or, helping with certain programs, education, etc. Well, I helped the particular farmer in question in Gujarat, who was an older gentleman. I helped him in terms of some of the irrigation programs. He was interested in trying to open up some of the channels itself. And there were several women that I worked with who helped me, learn about the processing. And in that sense, I helped them, in terms of the monetary, help them with some of their needs, immediate monetary needs.
Well, we have time for, I think, one last question.
Okay.
And I wanted to ask about the situation now. We see on our news screens the tension between India and Pakistan. We worry about it. And I was wondering what kinds of interactions there are between Indian archaeologists and Pakistani archaeologists who obviously work on the same problem.
Well, to date, the interaction has been very positive. We've had conferences that have brought together scholars from both Pakistan and India, both, within South Asia and also, in Europe and America, where we've had South Asian archaeology conferences. And there's been, a lot of interaction, exchange of ideas. There's been considerable amount of talk for, programs that bring together archaeologists who work in both sides of the line of control, so as to speak. Now, as far as what the future holds, we really have to wait and see where we're all headed. It is definitely something to be concerned about, but I really sincerely hope that archaeologists, we really remember that the line that's been drawn politically or historically was not a reality in the past, and hopefully we can continue with that kind of interaction.
And how do European and American archaeologists fit into that? I mean, those that work in Pakistan and those that work in India, do they?
There is a lot of interaction, and there are scholars who work both in Pakistan and India at the same time, you know, where they have projects in both the countries, which again shows that, you know, this line, the political line that has been drawn historically, really, you know, is just a political line. And as scholars who study the past and the present, we really should not be viewing that as a line of, you know, control. It should really be much more permeous than it is for political reasons. Yeah.
And finally, do you have plans to go back to India to do field work?
I would love to go back, you know, to India and pursue some of the issues that I have been working on. Specifically, one of the things that I'm interested in pursuing is look at the role of ethnicity and how ethnicity is expressed in the foodways in terms of crop processing. Do different ethnic groups process it differently? Mm-hmm. Is it just related to the morphology, you know, the botany of the plant, or is there room for ethnic expression? And definitely, you know, there's been a lot of work done on the cuisines, but specifically how the preparations and how that can be identified archaeologically. To look for signatures, that would be my next research focus.
Well, Seetha, it's been great having you, and we're looking forward to seeing your book, which is going to appear shortly, and I hope you'll come back. And
thank you, Tom. It was a pleasure.
My guest tonight has been Dr. Seetha Reddy. My name's Tom Levy, and it's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you.